Hey guys, Martin, Furnish guy with you, or for some of you, Martin, the furnished guy. It apparently sounds like that when I say my name. I don't know about that, but it's alright. For the third installment of my Size Does Matter series, which I cleverly called Size Still Matters, this is five hand histories. Uh, about different bet sizing spots. Some over bets, some under bets, some more like general psychology on bet sizing spots. Uh, there's stuff for all the family in that, so enjoy it. Have a good one. Hey guys, what's up? Jiggy with you for the Size Does Matter series. This is the first hand. The hands that I've chosen, well, actually, I asked you guys to send me hand stories if you had any questions and any specific spots you wanted to talk about. And I received three hands, which is not bad. Could have been better, but not bad. So I will treat these three hands, and then I've got two of my own hands that I want to talk about on spots that kind of look like the same and stuff. It's a lot of river spots over bet and some other stuff too, basically. So I'll go right away before I bore you out. So this one sent by Mr. Disjam. I'll comment on the whole hand actually. The most interesting spot here is going to be on the river, but there's some interesting thinking to have before too. So yeah, raise from under the gun +1. Sorry about the replayer, by the way. It's all that I found for uh, the format of hand the story sent me. If you do send me in the stories, if it would be possible to have it, by the way, in like full tilt format, that'd be perfect. That was Oldham Manager, and for some reason I couldn't import it in my own Oldham Manager, so whatever. Yeah, and it calls in the big blind. Uh, that is certainly my default play here against a under the gun +1 guy. Just flatting that ace queen offsuit. I think against most players, again, it's gonna be the best way to play it. Uh, the way that's gonna show you the most profits. Uh, just a bit of history on that player. The reads, oh, sorry, the reads that okay, yeah, the reads that my guy sent me here. He's basically telling me that the villain here, Vasgoed, is the biggest like nit on the planet. He describes him as a non-creative nit that makes the most nitty standard plays ever. So I'm sure your games all are all full of these guys, and this is going to be important following the rest of the hand, the plan for the hand, basically. So yeah, I'll go ahead. Flop goes check check. Turn is a king, and our friend here, Jam, decides to lead to the player. This is a good play if you have a good plan to go along with it. Uh, if your only plan basically here is to fire turn and give up after against a nit, it's probably the worst play possible. Just because you basically have the very best non-pair hand, and he's probably peeling at least once with basically any sort of pair. Unless he's got like fives and downs or stuff like that. He might fold, but your bet basically accomplishes nothing. But if you know that your opponent is like the most standard nit, who makes the most nitty standard plays ever, this is a really good spot actually to go for a barrel on a turn plus the river, because especially if you know that your opponent never has a king there and he rarely looks up people liked and stuff. Uh, I really like the play that this jam here made, and I will basically tell you why. So he decides to go ahead and bet the turn 9, already planning to bet on the river, as I, from what I understand. And of course, our net calls the turn with what pretty much everyone would agree here is something like a something that has a little showdown value, like a mid pocket pair, 9x, stuff like that. Most of the time, the rare king x. But for some reason, if you lot of these players don't even check back top pairs because they're not creative enough. Uh, you have to keep in mind a good range for your opponent here, and it looks like our friend DrGiggy had a good read of like medium strength hands that want to showdown basically. And on the river, pot is 33, and he decides to go ahead and follow ahead with his plan and bet 45 into it. And this is where it gets really interesting. This kind of bet basically is the kind of bet, especially on the river, that you're gonna be making when uh, most of the time when actually if I want to like put that vacuum spot in perspective, it's gonna be a spot where if you want to compare it to other spots, basically, you represent a very polarized range most of the time to the eyes of your opponent, especially this type of guy here. And by representing such a type of range, your opponent is gonna have a decision, of course, when you make that type of bet, and is going to make a big fold or a big call, basically, since the bet is big, if that makes any sense. Uh, what you want to do and what is the most important thing here against, not against, but in this type of spot, and it will sound pretty obvious when I say it, uh, but so many people misapply it so badly, is that your bet and the value of your bet here, whether it's a good bet or bad bet or a good play or whatever, is 100 to 112% dependent on your opponent and your opponent's skills and your opponent thinking process here. Here we basically have the perfect example of someone that you want to go ahead and make this kind of bet against, especially if you've got a good image. It's going to be dependent on your opponent and on your image too, obviously. It's going to be super, super important, your image, if you think your opponent actually pays attention to your image. But here, I would go ahead and say that this bet against some type of players, and maybe this guy in particular, I don't know from what I've read from the description that came with the hand story, this is a kind of bet that could basically work close to 100% of the time. And the beauty of the thing is that you really, really, really don't have to be balanced here until your opponent proves you that you have to, basically. You, there are guys that you could do that kind of play to for like 25 times in a row, and they will fold 100% of the time. And against this type of guy, you don't have to ask yourself the question why. Well, am I doing that play with big hands too? So like, am I balanced? Is it okay? Is my play plus EV because whether I'm balanced or not? Uh, if you have a good read on your opponent, you have to use it. You don't have to turn like the question around and kind of be scared of, oh, he might see what I'm doing here or whatever. Be one step ahead of the guy, and it's all in like trying to get read and stuff. That's a very, very important skill for that kind of play, to be able to have some solid reads on the thinking processes of your opponents. But this is a perfect spot against the nit to go for an overbet because it just looks scary, basically. If you know that someone is not gonna make a hero call there, well, it is good. But there are players against who it would be a total moronic move, basically, to do that as a bluff. The trick here is not only to recognize, basically, whether this is a good overbet spot or not. The most important thing, and that's what I want you guys to understand, is whether this is a good opponent to overbet into, basically, in that specific spot. The spots will come by themselves with some practice, but you have to practice realizing against who you can make and against who you can't make this kind of play. And then ended up folding here. What probably was like middle sort of hand. So here, this is totally like an introduction to how badly your read on the player is going to be important in the choosing of your bet sizing, basically. And This is basically if the guy really is in it and he really like does not make big hero calls and you don't have a Mongol image, this is a absolutely picture perfect play, picture perfect uh, turn plus river bet because you basically receive the same line from your opponent almost every single time there from that kind of opponent, and he's gonna call the turn and fold the river like 95% of the time. So you make even more money than by like just trying to check it down, trying to be good or whatever. Even if trying to check it down might be like might show you profit against some players, doing that is gonna show you a bigger profit and it's gonna be optimal basically, and you're always looking to optimize your plays. So that's it for first, and I'll go on with hand number two. Hand number two, same player, DrGiggy here, our new best friend. Uh, let's see what happens. Basically, this is another river over bet spot, and this is another example of how badly how you think your opponent will react influences the best play here. Like puts you into a spot to be able to recognize what is the optimal play, basically. So here the guy who is going to beat Superstation is our villain, is going to be our villain. I'll come back on that later. Receive a call there, decides to call in the small blind. I think I kind of prefer 3-bet pre-flop because of this guy, but at the same time you could put yourself in, like you've got a lot of value most of the time against that type of player who buys in for like 40 big blinds. And nines are gonna be good a lot, and you want to put as much money in pre-flop as possible in that kind of spot out of position. But if you don't really know how to react, if that guy like comes over the top or just calls in between and then he shoves and then you're fucked. I mean, calling is super fine too. So flop comes 9-8-6, 2 diamonds. Really, really good spot to dunk lead into, I think. A couple of reasons. First, you're never losing value from the times that the original raiser has nothing at all, basically. Uh, unless he's like c-betting 100%. This is pretty much, if he missed totally, this is pretty much the very worst board to go ahead and c-bet against, especially against a guy who's short and a guy who called from the blind that just pretty much nails his range. So your c-bet is not going to show profit, and it's just a kamikaze c-bet with nothing. So first, dunk lead is good here because you can recognize that you don't lose value from the times your opponent has nothing at all, and he's gonna call with worse a lot, and a lot with hands that he would check with uh, most of the time. The only good thing that could be said about like checking is the fact that there's this guy talking last, and if he bets and then he shoves, he just checked and treated the big pot because it's three-way. But I mean, if this guy with 40 something big blinds decides to go broke on that flop, doesn't really matter, I think, who's gonna lead out. So you just prefer most of the time leading out yourself and hope that he decides to stack off with something with not much equity, basically. So our friend here recognizes that, leads out a good dunk lead of 40 into 20. Standard bet sizing here, no real, I don't think there's real merit to like going for an over bet here or like a min bet or something like that. I think a good standard size bet here is going to do the job that you wanted to do pretty much perfectly. I'm telling that just because I had a flash that you have to think about these things pretty much at every street. Like, it's not because you always dunk leads, let's say like 14 into 20 or like in this approximative range of sizing, that you have to stop thinking about it because spots will arise that dunk leading 32 here is going to be better. It's not going to be often, but if you can recognize those spots, well, you turn yourself into a great player, basically. So, receive a call from the original raiser, and the short stack goes away. Turn is pretty much perfect card, apart from like something pairing the board. This is really sexy. So you decide to lead again. You don't want your guy to like check back and take his free outs with a lot of stuff, or if he has like one pair plus draw type of hands, which he's gonna have a lot. You don't really want that to happen. Uh, Bets 39 into 48, which is another good sizing, I think. You can go on if you don't think you will give off any tails here. This is a really good spot to go on, like the larger side with a made hand and a weaker, like betting a bit bigger with made hand, big made hand, like in this case, and betting a bit smaller with a draw or bluff. Basically, this is a good spot to do so. But you have to be 100% certain that you're not going to give away any tails by doing that. Or if you do, you can like play with that and further further encounters with the player. But then again, I still think you have to choose the amount that is gonna show you like the optimal play for that specific spot, that specific hand. And like I said, unless you're afraid that he's gonna make big folds because you bet bigger, you can go big here because this is the kind of board basically that a player, if he has a pair plus a draw, he's like never ever folding unless you bet like 2x pot. Anything like pot and under, he's calling basically with a pair plus a draw, which is gonna make up a lot of his range here, or an overpaired two that did not want to raise a flop for some reason that could be possible. So you definitely want to kind of go big with a made hand. Like I said, if you don't think that will force him into making any uh, any hero fold, and that is important because betting big here with a good hand is gonna be a disastrous play against some players and is gonna be optimal against others. So you always want to keep those things in mind when you do play a hand. Uh, he calls, rivers a two of hearts because he runs. That's how he rolls. The board breaks, and pot is 126, and our friend here has 185 and 10. And that is where his description of villain is most important here. Uh, he describes him as a non-aggressive in between tight and loose that I expect can possibly think a little bit about what you could have. So I assume that to go ahead, I'll tell you right ahead what happened. He decided to shove here as a value bet. Pretty big overshove, like 1.5x the pot basically, which is pretty big. I assume that for that to be successful, most of the time you have to have a pretty aggressive MH first. This is really important. If you're perceived as a nit who never makes any plays, well, he's just gonna fold if he has any clue. If, like he said, uh, he can possibly think a little bit about what you could have, like my friend DrGiggy said in his description. So once again here, kind of a similar spot to the other. Whoa, sorry, kind of similar spot to the other hand when you basically represent a super polarized range of big hands that decided to lead and missed draws that decided to lead basically. And once again, whether or not this is a good play is 100% dependent on whether or not you think your opponent is going to call with one pair here. I think your opponent in that spot is either gonna show up with like a flush draw, big flush draw, or one pair. Never more than one pair, I think. No really possible two pairs, probably raising the flop. So the best hand he can possibly have is aces, basically. And like if he has a total missed draw, he's described as a non-aggressive player, so no real merit in checking because he might just like check back and give up. And the question you want to ask yourself basically is how big of a bet my opponent is going to be calling with one pair here. And if you can be able to the eyes of your opponent make it look like you have nothing, well, this is an absolute perfect spot for you to go ahead and force like your opponent into making a big hero call when they are wrong basically. So this is a perfect spot if you by any chance feel that your opponent might like look you up light here because of your image, because of the history, because of the flow. I cannot like analyze 2000 hands because I could play like this spot 2,000 times, and it's gonna be played like the best optimal play is gonna be different every time, basically. Well, not every time, but there are gonna be a lot of answers. But if you feel that, well, this guy might call, this is actually kind of same spot than the first hand where you represent something super polarized. So like the strength of his own hand doesn't really matter. He just it's just gonna be him debating whether he's calling with one pair or not, because like but at that point we all know basically, and he knows that you know that he's never showing up with better than one pair on that board. So if you think any hero call, you're showing a big profit with that kind of shove. And it ended up working. Those two ends actually look like brags a lot. But I don't care, though they were totally interesting. So yeah, it worked, and and that's it. It's supposed to work. Yeah, yeah. All in. Call. Is he gonna turn over his cards? Yeah, 5-6. So he did end up making the big hero call, and that was a perfect spot. Like I said once again, that's like the basic overbet spots. Uh, the famous spot where you represent super polarized range, but as you uh, as you start to be able to recognize recognize this one, you will be able to recognize a lot more too. Uh, so yeah, another thing I want to talk about, I'll try to do that quickly about that hand, which is not on the bet sizing, is that if you are this guy in that type of situation, that type of super dry board here, if you are against a great player, you definitely want to be balanced here. By that I mean if you're against a super aggressive player, this is totally the kind of board where you have to be able to slow play at least from time to time. Because, like I said, when you start calling down on that type of board, any good hand reader will know that you basically never have better than one pair. So this is a perfect spot for your opponent when the board breaks out to just put pressure on you. And the guy with initiative tends to win the pot so much more often. So like you have to give yourself a defense that otherwise you're always gonna be uh, like facing a sucky spot on the river because you're always gonna have like one pair and trying to debate, okay, am I hero calling that time? Is he bluffing that time? Because he will be bluffing if he's aggressive and stuff. So this is definitely the kind of board where against a guy like me, for example, if you're playing against me, slow play that. You're gonna be killing me every time basically if you slow play that board because I'm barreling off my ass pretty much always every single time that uh, I think I'm against a guy who is going to fold with one pair on that river. So, yep, that's pretty much all about that hand. You don't have to be balanced if you don't think your opponent is aggressive enough to put you on in that kind of sucky spot on the river. But if you do think so, this is a spot where, like I said, you totally have to have some defense to the move that is gonna be good for him pretty much every single time because he's gonna put you the pressure and it's gonna be easier for him to be balanced in that spot basically. So yeah, that's it for hand two. Hand number three, I've chosen it because it really looks like the first two spots from my boy Dish Jam here. So I'll just play the hand, and it's a hand that I've played like this month actually that I stumbled upon, and I thought it was good for another example for the kind of spot that we were talking about. Uh, I go ahead and min raise my button. This is 510, 127 big blinds deep, effective. Opponent 3 bets me to 70, and I easily call in position with my ace-6 suited, ace-9 suited, delicious ace-9 suited. From what I remember from that guy, he was kind of playing like not totally standard game, uh, taking some weird lines from time to time. I did not have that big of a read, but this was in my mind certainly someone was thinking, and this was not like your standard tag player. Uh, doesn't mean he's good, doesn't mean he is bad. He might do some real gross mistakes, when they try to take those tricky lines sometimes, but they might do some real elite plays as well. At the time I was kind of still unsure of whether he was good or bad, and I remember that, but I don't even remember if I ended up deciding between him being good or bad. But that's not really important. What's important was my read at the moment, and it was what I just talked about. Flop comes Jack 8 7. I flop over gut shot over card and not flush draw, pretty much nuts. If he bets, I'm probably just raising, getting it in because my draws are not well concealed if I hit them, and he could sometimes fold like some pair hands that he's like betting and like I don't know ace 7 or something like that he decides to bet and then fold to a raise. So it's a pretty good, or like ace king ace queen that I'm behind basically of. So raising is super fine, but he decides to check. So I decide to go ahead and fire a bet, a pretty small bet here. Main reason is that I basically always fire those not too big amounts in that kind of spot because I think this is totally putting your opponent in the shitty spot because he knows basically that he rarely is going to have the nuts when he checks that. So, like, let's say I bet like I'm gonna extend that to even further. There are a lot of times when, let's say the action is that I have nothing at all. Let's say I call with like ace 10 of suit. I flop pretty much nothing and he checks. I'm gonna bet something ridiculous like 40 into 145 because this is definitely the kind of spot if my opponent like has ace king, ace queen, king queen, hands like that with like 2 overcards and no equity, where they will just say, "Oh, pot is not that big, just fuck off." Like I can't represent shit since I've checked that flop, especially when they like never really check raise for value or stuff like that on that kind of board. This is totally a good spot to like bet something ridiculous and get away with it at a really cheap price. So I decided to make it just a bit bigger, probably just feeling of how I was feeling about the guy and how he could react to that. And I was trying to find the amount basically that could the most often possible make him like check raise as a bluff so I can shove over and win a sizable pot with my my bluff. So I bet 80 and he check calls into me. Turn is gent card, queen of spades. He checks. I bet 210, which is pretty big. Well, pretty big for like standard of that kind of spot because once again, in that kind of dynamic in hand, this is kind of dynamic that I'm really going to be betting small, unless I've got some reason to do otherwise. And I think this is a spot where I already had a really aggressive image on that guy, and he probably knows that like if he checks here, I'm barreling flop and turn close to 100% of the time when I do have absolutely nothing at all, which is pretty much true with the dynamic that we had. So I decided that you probably would not really look into my bet sizing, so I decided to make it as big as possible so I get as much money in as possible and leave myself with something as close to possible to pot on the river without being really suspicious. And so yeah, I did not. I think that was far better than like betting, I don't know, 80 again. I don't think that would have induced any like spazzes against this guy on that street basically. So I bet 210 he calls again. At that point, I'm like thinking, and I think it can be assumed right for uh, almost everyone here that he basically has one pair. Any type of one pair, he pretty much never ever has better than one pair basically. Same kind of spot. Where I'm gonna be super polarized. My opponent can't represent a big hand. The 3 spots looked exactly like that we talked about so far. So this is, in theory, a good spot to overbet. Just because you put your opponent into a really, really tough situation. You get the initiative, so you win the pot super often, and you force him into making some mistakes. And I decided at that point that uh, it really, to my opponent's highs here, it really didn't matter whether I would bet 320 like 580 or just shove because he probably already decided whether he's gonna hero call me or not on the turn, basically. So I think all bet sizing kind of credibly represent a bluff. I'm gonna have a lot of bluffs in that kind of spot against a lot of players. This time against that player, I would probably just have given up the river because I thought that he was intelligent enough to like uh, not check call turn to check fold the river unless he has something like ace eight. He cannot have the ace of spades, so I have it. So let's say like Jack 10 with Jack of spades or stuff like that. Those are the ends that he might fold if I like shove. But then again, I think I even induce some more hero calls sometimes with those weakish pair type of hands when I do shove here. And like I said, I did not think he would like call the turn to fold the river from what I've seen with the range that I was assessing him in that spot. So yeah, I decided to go for maximum value here, which means that if I was bluffing, if I had nothing at all, uh, if I had been on my game, this was a spot where I would definitely have just given up being on my game because I don't think with like the history that we have, like I said, and my image and stuff, that he was folding this river very much. So being on your game there is really important on your reads and stuff. And when we talk about being on your game and playing your A game and stuff like that, this is just getting a good feeling, and you know it when you're in the zone and you get that feeling of whether you check call the turn to check fold the river or you check call the turn to check call the river with pretty much anything. Uh, so I decided to just shove, and he ended up calling with kings, which is the top of his range, and I think he absolutely has to call unless he's reading like game flow reading me totally, and he knows that I'm not bluffing there, uh, which I doubt is really possible with the history that we had, but he could have done it as well. But top of his range pretty much has to call. I could be like value betting ace queen here with a shove, so pretty big cooler, but I did manage to get as much money in as possible on the river because I like rightfully so recognize a good spot. And it kind of made me sad because I would have liked the stacks to be a bit bigger just to brag and show off that I made a bigger overbet. But basically, I think my point is I think he would have called something like up to 1.2k, maybe even sometimes with the image that I had at the moment. So this is pretty much it for that hand. I'm back with hand number four. I warn you right away, this could possibly like be the very worst replayer you will ever encounter in the video, but I did not manage to find anything else to do with that type of hand story. Once again, if you do send me in the stories, it would be super appreciated if you send it in full tilt or not in that converted style, just because it makes it easier for a replayer to play it. Basically, all the miniature is fine too. I will get something going with that. But anyway, we will read the end of the story together and see what happens. This is not really an overbet spot, but this is another spot where your sizing is gonna once again 100% depend on your opponent, and I think this is something here that the Blue Fire member James Bruce, thank you James Bruce, who sent me that hand, kind of didn't get right away, from what I understand from his description of the hand and thought process, basically. Uh, his question, which I will read first, is Jiggy, when I get deep stacked, I sometimes have no clue how much to make my bet sizing when I raise, given the amount of money that I have behind to protect my hand when I flop a monster, as is the case in this hand. I would love you to see your analysis of this one. And he feels like he should have bet a bit more on the flop. Uh, the question is good, but it's not the best question that you have to ask yourself. I think you really need to go deeper in that kind of question, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. So this is 10.25 cents, which is perfectly fine. I mean, I don't care what stakes are. Question about and the stories and good basics are always good to come back and revisit and make sure that they're all good and you are thinking the right way about the game. So under the gun, 4 away, raise to 1, button calls you in position, no blind comes along, it sets up and you're out of position. And guess what? You flop the absolute nuts. Yay! Uh, The flop is the pot is 255. You bet close to pot, which is pretty big. Let's say I will not assume anything in that. Let's say he balances that with other stuff, or if he had to balance it or whatever. Sorry. And his opponent raises him to 550 here, and we are pretty deep. We are oh, I did not want to do that. 44 bucks, which is deep. Not not exactly like 200 big blinds, but deep, let's say. And button raises, and the question is about the sizing of the 3-bet on that flop, to how much you have to raise to re-raise here. And once again, I'm gonna answer my old answer that I answered to almost any question that someone asks me. My answer is it depends, and it depends on first your image, the range that you're assessing your opponent, the image of your opponent, and the game flow. Basically, it depends on what you want to induce your opponent into doing, basically, and what you think he has and what you think he's gonna be doing with like the biggest part of his range, a part of his range that's gonna interest you, basically. You did not mention like my friend here, James, did not mention anything about the player here, and I think this is really a mistake because I can't give you the best answer if I don't have any reads. Here, basically, the thing you want to do, you flop the nuts. Protecting your hand is one of the last things that you have to consider because, especially with the Jack of Hearts here, all you want to do is put the money in as fast as possible to be able to get as much money as possible from stuff like Ace 10, Queen 10, Ace Queen, a set of 10s, Queens, Aces. You don't want like a flush to fall against those hands. You don't want a like a forced trade coming that would kill the action as well. Those are the kind of things you don't want, and you don't care about protecting that much because no matter what, like no matter how much you make it, I think you're gonna be committed on like almost any turn, on like unless like the turn is I don't know, I don't even see like unless it is like an ace and the guy's super nitty, you could some like you could end up finding a fold at some point in the hand for sure. But let's say if the turn is not something totally shitty, you're gonna be committed no matter what. So you kind of erase that from your priorities when you are deciding how much to bet size. And this is totally a question of what is my opponent's range here, and once again, what do I want him to do with the part of his range that is gonna interest me. Uh, there are some players here, and I'm gonna kind of make a short list of kind of players you're gonna encounter and how to play against them. It's gonna be not gonna be 100% accurate, of course, uh, but it should give you an idea at least. There are players here who are never ever gonna raise as a bluff, basically. And I think at the micros and small stakes, this is going to be true a lot. This is a kind of board where people don't feel like raising as a bluff because they tell themselves, well, I raise often enough on that board with either a monster that I'm gonna have quite a lot or a big draw that I'm gonna have quite a lot. So I'm already balanced. I don't really have to like raise as a bluff, and this is totally a mistake because this is kind of board where you're raised as a bluff unless you're doing it against someone who's like never c-betting and he's like c-betting there. It's gonna show you profit a lot, a whole lot with like only a gut shot, and raising that flop and bluffing of your stack is gonna show you a big profit. But I assume that this guy probably at the micros doesn't have display in his arsenal, basically doesn't have the balls to do that kind of thing without like a big combo draw or at least two pairs. So if you're against that type of guy who always has either a combo draw or two pair, you basically want to bet as much as possible without like it being too suspicious. You would like to get all the money in basically on the flop, so there's no card that could kill your action that could come on the turn because on that kind of board that could happen. And you don't want like let's say you're against a flush draw and the board pairs, so he stops chasing or stuff like that to happen. You just want to put as much money with the nuts as possible in on the flop, especially out of position here. Especially out of position. So I think against any normal guy, you can make it something like ridiculous, like 22 bucks. And since you're kind of still balanced with your big big draws as well. He's not like gonna fold ace queen if you make it super big. You can make it really big against these guys. If this is a guy, if this is an aggressive game and you're against someone who is raising a lot of these boards as a bluff and as semi bluff with, let's say, stuff like king queen with the king of hearts, which is totally awesome play by the way to do if he's that guy because he has some blockers to big ends and yada yada. You want to induce something stupid if you feel like stuff like king queen with the king of hearts is a big part of your opponent's range here. You don't want to make it 22 because you're just giving him most of the time an easy decision to go ahead and fold. And if he knows that you're going to be doing that a lot as a bluff, you do want to balance. And since you don't want to make it too big when you do bluff, uh, you want to balance and make it as small as possible. And anyway, if the game is so aggressive, he's gonna be more committed than ever on the turn, no matter what the turn comes. So, like I said, this is totally a spot where you have to ask yourself, uh, like, is it really relevant how much I'm betting? Like, is it gonna change something if I bet big or if I bet not big? First question that you have to answer, you don't really have to protect your hand for the reasons that I talked about. And second question is, what's my opponent's range and what's my perceived range here, and how can I make the optimal amount bet sizing amount here according to those things, and to the your range are going to be absolutely defined by the reads and the game flow and stuff like that. So I think I can't answer whether that play was bad or not or good because I don't know what type of player was the other player, but I'm gonna assume he's like a standard to 10-25 cent player. I would have made that just bigger, just to put as much money in the pot as possible, make him feel committed with like any flush draw, any big flush draw, like King X flush draw, Jack X, no, not Jack X flush draw, Ace X flush draw that decided to raise, any Ace Queen, Ace 10, don't want to see any card fall, etc., etc. So he makes it 1475. Opponent calls. Turn is hard, which is not the best card, but it's not the worst card. It's a lot less worse than like an ace, I think. You decide to ship just because I think this is still the best play to get some value from all two pairs and stuff against most players under normal circumstances, and you're totally committed, especially with like the Jack of Hearts for sometimes a redraw, and button ends up calling rivers at 10, you're fucked, and yeah, the King Knight for a flush. But I just wanted to precise basically on that hand on the question that was asked by my friend here. Uh, like, it was a good thing to question yourself about the sizing here, but you have to like ask the right questions, and those were the right questions that you want to ask yourself about this kind of spot, this kind of sizing. And yep, that is it for and number four. Going for the last hand. Yeah. Hand number 5 with Doctor DrGiggy. Sorry. This one, no particular theme to it. I just found this hand really interesting in a bet sizing context, and in whole context, I think it's just a really interesting spot, really interesting hand. So I've chosen it, and here it goes. I raise $30 under the gun +1 with ace 8 suited. Zwacky here with a regular. Ooh, like at that point in the session, I remember that we were both playing super aggressively. He was on most of my tables, and we were battling back and forth a lot. And I basically felt like not that I felt anything about this tree, but this is definitely the kind of spot where it's gonna be super light because we're super deep, and he has direct possession on me. So I do want to play back at him when I do get an opportunity to do so. And with that deepness of stacks here, pre-flop, ace-6 suited is definitely a hand that I want to go ahead and do something, and just play back at my opponent, whether it's going to be by calling the 3-bet or by 4-betting. With like that big of a stack, I actually ended up 4-betting for a couple of reasons. I think this is a really good play. This is basically not like a 4-bet bluff in the pure meaning of the term 4-bet bluff, because it's like a 4-bet semi bluff. Because if I get called, I represent a really strong range, really polarized but strong range, which is gonna lead into some interesting stuff. the pot is gonna be super big, and I am going to have the initiative, which is super important. And I feel that against this guy, he's gonna be peeling pre-flop pretty often when I like four bet here with stuff I like. I don't know, Jack ten suited or stuff like that. He's definitely calling those. So I'm ahead of a certain part of his range. I get the initiative, and basically I feel that the four bet is the best way to play it, because if I just call it out of position, it's gonna be really tough to play without having the initiative, and without having position, it's gonna be really tough for me to do something about my end and like represent a strong enough range for me to make my plays balanced and profitable and aggressive enough to win the pot often enough. I do like initiative in those kind of spots. So yeah, I decided to four bet for all those reasons. Like I said, this is not four bet like bluff. This is more of four bet semi bluff. That's why I decided to go ahead and do it with like ace egg suited, which is going to play super well on a lot of boards, basically, even out of position, especially when I flop like the nut flush draw, which is something that I definitely am looking forward to flopping in that kind of spot. In a standard like 100 big blind situation, I would have four bet. If I decide to bluff, my hand would obviously not have mattered as much. I could have done it with any stupid thing that has kind of a blocker, like ace deuce of suit or shit like that. But being that deep, since I know that my opponent is gonna call a lot, I anticipate basically a lot of calls. Uh, I like forbidding with hands that are gonna be playable and are gonna have some equity, and he does call, which is something that I think he's gonna do. Like I said, very often in that position. So the pot is already super big, and there is 591 in it. I've got basically 2.3k behind, which is effective stack. I flopped up here on a pretty dry board. The flop decision is super interesting here. I think there are merits to both betting and checking, definitely. This is once again a spot where the best play is going to be decided by the range and how your opponent will react and what's his best chance of playing back at you and stuff. Uh, I decided to bet that time. No like big particular reason. I just felt like he could look me up pretty like for at least one street, maybe two. And I also felt like I was basically not sure whether he would bluff a lot or not when I checked to him. If here I am against someone who's like going to represent my check as like queens or kings pretty much every single time I check to him in that on that board, and I know he's gonna like try to make me fold those hands by the river, and he's gonna fire big. Check call, check call, check call is definitely a better line. But against someone here, I really did not know whether he would do that or not. So if I just gave him back the initiative, I was fearing that I would just make a mistake trying to decide whether to call or not. So I decided to just put the pressure on him, make him do some mistakes with his calling, and keep my range basically as wide as possible, so I am not readable at all. Which I think is really important in that kind of spot. And I told myself, since I basically, because I'm against a thinking player, that is always keep that in mind here. I'm against a good thinking player. You don't want to go that far in your thought process if you're playing. Uh, don't want to be like condescending, but if you're playing like 25-50 cents, again, the type of villain that we just saw in like N4. So with all that in mind, I decided to bet to be balanced, have a wide range. I think it's just gonna show better, like more optimal play against that guy, because I really did not know what to do if I checked to him that time. Uh, so with my reads, I finally decided that betting 240, which would be like my standard bet with air and stuff, and like I said, which would keep my uh, range as balanced as possible, is going to be the best play. Turn is an ace, and this is really a tricky spot because since I know, and he knows that I know, that there are a lot of like ace queen suited, ace jack suited, ace 10 suited in his range there. Uh, this is probably not the kind of spot that I expect my specific opponent here to go ahead and believe that I'm gonna be bluffing him big there. So if he does not think that I have a lot of big bluffs in my range, if I go for like uh, if I go for stacks here, basically, uh, betting like going for stacks is definitely not a good idea because I'm not gonna get called by worse uh, against a good player very often here. So like going for stacks, I think is kind of a mistake because I'm just never ever gonna get called by worse, and I'm gonna get stacked every time he has like ace queen ace jack. So I decided to rule that one out, even if at first glance it did look like a good option to go for my sizing, like I don't know, 500 and then ship 1.5k on the river. Uh, because well, it's a 4-bet pot and I have trips, so fuck it. I hope he calls it with force. But thinking about all that, I decided that this sizing was definitely not the best against that guy. I thought about checking as well, but problem with checking is I really don't know if my opponent is gonna take a stab here if he like floated the flop. I don't think he ever floated the flop with air, and I don't think that he has like something as weak as like a straight like a gut shot here very often. Maybe like 8-9, he's definitely gonna peel one if he called with that pre-flop, but I don't think there are that many sort of hands in his range. I'm talking about this like part of his range because this is kind of this is the part of his range that I want to like if I'm on a board where there are a lot of things that he would have called pre-flop that are like gut shots and stuff like that he knows he can't win the pot with, I definitely want to go like check call and hope that he bluffs with all of these holdings. But since this is not a board where he's gonna have that many like pure bluffs, and I expect him to be like trying to show down his hand more often than trying to bluff me out here, or I expect him to have a flush draw on the flop, which is totally possible as well if he has like any any suited like any suited connector that he's decided to call with in diamonds pre-flop. He's definitely calling the flop, so this is a pretty big part of his range. I think, especially with what I thought would be his pre-flop range. And I know he's probably not raising with like naked flush draw on that flop because I could too easily come back over the top with like ace king or ace queen. I'm gonna have a lot here. So I decided checking is not that good because he's not bluffing that much, and I don't want to give him a free card, which I think he will do with like the king x flush draw and things like that because he still has some pretty decent uh, showdown value. And I don't think he has like no showdown value at all often. So I decided to bet pretty small once again. I could have gone even smaller, and it's basically I'm just fucking with him. Basically, I'm almost turning my hand over, uh, because I'm telling him like I don't have that big of a hand, and I'm just betting smaller to for you to call with just a bit like worse hands than me. Hope he does that. It's not a perfect spot because we're still pretty deep and out of position and stuff. But by eliminating the two other options, I think this is the best option that I was left with. Not going for stack, don't want to check. I think betting really small is my best option here because he's just gonna be curious very much in the heat of a session. No matter like how good of a hand reader he is in that kind of spot. Let's say he's gonna have like queens or kings or like ace deuce suited, any worse ace x suited. If I bet big, basically this is kind of spot where he's like he's gonna be able to make a big fold. That's just a spot where he's gonna make a big fold very often. If I bet standard to like big standard things, uh, I don't want him to give him that chance. And like I said, no matter like I was about to say, basically, no matter how good of a hand reader he is, uh, he's gonna make some angry calls, especially with that super aggressive dynamic. If he has queens or kings, which is a big part of his range that I'm targeting here with my plan to bet super small on the turn plus the river, which is actually what I did. Uh, I know he's gonna make like some angry calls of like, oh shit, I know he has it, but I can't help myself. So and this totally has the added benefit of all the times that I'm beaten by ace jack suited, ace queen, ace king that he's gonna call with a lot in position, the 4-bet, which is still pretty often. I'm definitely saving myself some money from the times where I would have decided to like just go broke. So I thought that this was the optimal play and ended up calling reverse total break. I was like, I've got a pot size bet. I could check, but I don't think he's like going for the big bluff with ace, like, not ace, but with like missed diamonds here, which is the only thing that has no showdown value that he's gonna have on the river. Uh, I could shove. I think it allows him to make some really, really big folds if I do shove, because he still could have a very big hand in his range as well. So I decided to bet super small and make him just make angry calls. And it looks stupid because like it's like 1/3 of the pot and less than 1/3 of the pot on turn and river, but it is really, really sizable, and it is almost 100, not 100, but like 80 big blinds difference between that and trying to show down my hand, because I'm kind of scared that he could have a better raise and I don't think he's calling with worse. Realizing that this sizing exists in that kind of spot showed me a profit, like in that specific spot, since he pretty much had the very best hand for my play. I ended up being lucky on that one. Uh, that my play worked so well. Uh, it gave me like 80 big blinds. It's gonna not gonna give me like 80 Galfan big blinds, let's say, like the tier rig big blinds again this range, because I'm losing sometimes, and sometimes I'm kind of missing some value. But I think this is the play that is gonna give me the most big blinds possible by either. It's just the fact that with all the dynamic that we had, you want to be able to recognize those kind of spots, basically, where the underbet, because I'm not talking about a lot about underbets, I know, where the underbet is going to be good, and the other underbet, never ever 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 never ever underestimate the power of like a small river value bet when your opponent's hand range is pretty weak and he knows he's going to fold to a big bet. Just make a small bet, so he's just snapping it off curiously and pissed offly, if such a thing exists. Never underestimates that, because when you get to the river, pots are big, and even the smallest of bets is really, really big, like 5 big blinds into a 50 big blind pot. Well, at the end of the day, if you make like 5 of these, that's a lot of big blinds that you are definitely adding to your win rate. So the under bet in that kind of spot is so sexy. I wanted to talk about it with you guys. So I guess that's it. That's it for the video. It was, I hope, interesting. And once again, if you want to send me some other end histories, so I don't have to like go in my own hand histories and look like I'm bragging every single hand I show you. That would be super nice. I'm definitely gonna make more videos about this kind of stuff if you guys like them, especially about bet sizing and stuff, because I think I could go on that subject for like ever, because there's still plenty of possible spots, possibilities that are left to be discovered. If you want to send me any stories, once again, please do so at DrGiggy@hotmail.com. And that's it. Have a good one.